Good day. The twin crises in Ukraine and Belarus continue to fester, and the person who is central to the resolution of both of them, or the potential resolution of both of them, Russian President Vladimir Putin, has now spoken in public about them. And he's done so in the format of a television interview on Russian state television, on Russia's main Russian television channel, Rossiya 1. Now, this is an unusual step for Putin to take. He doesn't often give television interviews in this kind of format, and he has done so, obviously, in view of the various comments and suggestions and observations and criticisms and charges and counter-charges that have been swirling around the international media and on the part of Western governments. The interview is actually relatively short, and the Kremlin has provided a readout very fast, which gives an indication of how important it is to the Russian government to get Putin's words on this issue out as quickly as possible. I should say that it's particularly unusual for the Kremlin to get an interview like this transcribed, translated into English, and published on the Kremlin website so fast on a weekend. Anyway, one particular issue which I noticed was not covered in this interview at all was the visit of CIA Director Burns to Moscow. This bizarre affair, which as far as I can see has only ended by making Russian-American relations even worse than they were before, is now apparently seen as such a ghastly debacle that neither side wants to talk about it anymore. But on the issues of Belarus and Ukraine, Putin had much to say. And as I think the best way to say it is by quoting his words, that is precisely what I want to do. I will provide a link to this transcript, the Kremlin's readout of this interview under this video. But since I know many of you listen to me on your car radios, I think perhaps it's appropriate also if I quote his exact words from the interview. So the first point that he discussed and touched on is the situation in Belarus. And he received a question from the Russian interviewer, Pavel Zarubin, and it read as follows: Mr. President, tensions are escalating on the border between the EU and Belarus. The European Union has already deployed army troops. Actually, that's not correct. The European Union doesn't yet have an army. Monsieur Macron, the president of France, wants it to, but he doesn't yet have it, not for the moment at least. The military that's been deployed to the border with Belarus is, of course, the Polish military. There were several people who have observed in the threads to my previous program, both on this channel, on YouTube, and on Locals, the British Boris Johnson can't stay out of this sort of party, and we're now getting reports that a small number of British officials and troops have gone to assist the Poles. Do what precisely? I have absolutely no idea. Britain, by the way, is not part of the European Union, so these British troop deployments, such as they are not the European Union deploying army troops to the Polish border, as Mr. Zarubin says. But anyway, to continue. Moreover, they are building up the contingent. You spoke with Angela Merkel twice, and you also spoke with Alexander Lukashenko. Why do they not speak to each other directly is probably also a question I would like to ask you. In general, what do you think of the developments there? And the first point that Putin touches on is about the fact that Merkel and Lukashenko, and indeed the EU and Lukashenko, at the moment aren't talking to each other. And he says this in response to this particular point. To begin with, why do they not speak with each other is not a question for me. We have nothing to do with this. But I inferred from my conversations with Lukashenko and Merkel that they are ready to speak with each other. I hope it will happen soon and some sort of direct contact will be established between the European Union, the EU leading nations, or at least between the Federal Republic of Germany and Belarus. This is crucial because the migrants' goal is primarily to get into Germany. Now, I do not share Putin's optimism about this. Obviously, the logical, correct, and appropriate thing in order to resolve the crisis is for Merkel or some other EU official, some senior EU official, and, by the way, for the Polish government also to pick up the telephone and talk to Alexander Lukashenko, who is the de facto and indeed de jure president of Belarus as we speak. I've said many times that I understand that the European Union doesn't like Lukashenko, wants Lukashenko removed from power, denies the legitimacy of the presidential result that came out of the presidential election held in Belarus last year, and indeed doubts President Lukashenko's legitimacy or right to rule or lead Belarus. The reality, however, is that he is the person in power in Belarus. He controls the bureaucracy, the civil service, the foreign ministry answers to him, as does the diplomatic corps, and of course the military in Belarus and the security services accept him as the commander-in-chief. So you should deal with the person who is actually in charge. However, the European Union finds that extraordinarily difficult to do because they are worried that if they speak to Lukashenko, they are somehow accepting him as the legitimate president of Belarus. I've said previously that that is an absurdity. I've also said previously that the Russians, for their part, are perfectly willing to talk to people like the authorities, the government in Ukraine and the Taliban in Afghanistan, whose legitimacy they also question. They recognize that they are the power in Ukraine and Afghanistan respectively, and therefore they have to deal with these people whether they like it or not. And the Russians recognize this and pragmatically work on that basis. But the European Union is a different creature entirely. It finds it impossible to show that degree of pragmatism and flexibility. And though it is obviously open for Merkel to pick up the telephone and talk to Lukashenko, and though I have no doubt at all that Lukashenko would be delighted if Merkel did that, I think that Merkel herself is far too nervous and worried about the reaction from the other EU states and from the EU bureaucracy and from part of the political class in Germany and from the United States if she were to do such a thing. So I think that though the obvious, correct, pragmatic and right thing to do is to talk to Lukashenko, despite what Putin was told by Merkel and by Lukashenko, I don't think Merkel or the European Union are going to do it. Anyway, there we are. Let's proceed with the rest of what Putin said. In this collection, I would like to remind you that our foreign ministry has already stated we should not forget the roots of these migration crises. Was it Belarus that unleashed these problems? No, the problems were caused by the West, by the European countries. These problems have political, military and economic dimensions. Military because everyone participated in the Iraq operations and now there are many Kurds from Iraq among the migrants. They had also fought in Afghanistan for 20 years, thus there are more and more Afghans there. Belarus has nothing to do with this. The migrants were also moving via different routes And it is not surprising that they're now going through Belarus because, as Mr. Lukashenko told me, Belarus has visa-free arrangements with the countries of origin. Now, there's a number of points to be made here. Firstly, Putin is wrong. Not every European country participated in the Iraq War, which is, of course, instigated not by the European countries, but by the United States. Germany was not directly involved in the Iraq War. In fact, it was opposed to it, as, of course, was France. Other European countries, Poland, for example, did participate in the Iraq War. It is correct, however, that all the European states, to a greater or lesser degree, participated in the war in Afghanistan because, of course, they all are signed up to NATO, and NATO resolved, with the agreement of all the NATO member states, that they should participate in the war in Afghanistan. And Putin's larger point that Europe is paying the price for these wars, or the various regime change wars, which the United States and its European allies have waged and fomented across the Middle East, and that price takes the form of large migrant flows. Well, that, I think, is indisputable and unchallengeable, and it is indisputable and unchallengeable, so much so that, of course, you never see anybody in the United States or in Europe, in the EU, or indeed in Britain, ever admit to that fact, that it is regime change, the regime change wars, the foreign policy of the Western powers that has triggered this crisis. That is too uncomfortable a truth ever to be acknowledged. Now, whether it is correct that Belarus has visa-free arrangements with the countries of origin, I'm not so sure, but I believe it is, and I know for a fact that it is with respect to Turkey, and of course it is from Turkey that many of these migrants who are currently on the Polish border have come. Anyway, let's proceed with the next section. First come military and political causes. But there are also economic factors. And now Putin gets very interesting. There are very high social benefits for migrants in Europe, very high indeed. Say, given high unemployment, a good worker in the Middle East, including in oil-producing countries, even if he's employed in the oil industry, earns a fraction of the social benefits that non-working migrants get, for example, in the Federal Republic of Germany. It is natural that people are heading there. Why should they work in turbulent conditions when basic safety rules are not observed, when they can live idly with their families and get twice or three times as much? Because these benefits cover both adults and children, free education as a rule, free medical care. Let me reiterate, this is the policy of Europe's leading nations. Now, this is, I suspect, uncomfortable also for many Europeans, and indeed for many Westerners, but there is a very powerful element of truth behind it. What draws migrants to the European Union, like a magnet, is the fact that many EU countries have very generous welfare states. And they don't just have generous welfare states, they also have very generous social policies as well, which broadens the nature of the people who are entitled to welfare provision once they arrive at these countries. And that indisputably is the case. As was recently pointed out to me in a live program, which I did, which you can watch fully on our Locals platform, migrants from the Middle East do not go, for example, to Japan because Japan does not have a welfare system. Certainly not a welfare system that remotely compares to the one you find in Germany and to a greater or lesser extent across the European Union. And the observation which has been made to me is that if you are going to operate such a very generous welfare system, then you have to be extremely careful about opening your door up to migrant flows, because that welfare system is going to be a magnet of attraction to migrants. And of course, if you do open your doors in that sort of way, then you have problems about the potential overload of that system. Now, as I said, this is uncomfortable. It's not something that some European politicians want to discuss. It's in fact difficult to discuss it in certain European contexts, and you stand all kinds of risks if you do raise it. But again, the practical reality, the pragmatic fact is that it is true, or at least it contains a high element of truth. And Putin is absolutely right to bring it up. It's interesting that nobody in the West discussing this particular issue discusses it. And then he goes on to discuss, in his very usual, very systematic way, the Polish reaction. On the one hand, however, we kept hearing that humanitarian issues must be given top priority. However, when Polish border guards and army troops on the Belarus-Poland border take action, vigorous action, I'm paraphrasing some of his words, against migrants, and use and fire combat weapons over their heads, blast sirens and spotlights onto their camps, where there are women and children, all that does not go well with the ideas of humanism, which supposedly underlie all policies of our Western neighbours. I have to say that I find this dwelling by Putin and Lukashenko on these humanitarian issues rather, distasteful. I think that one shouldn't perhaps dwell on these things. Governments sometimes have to take tough action to control their borders, but given the way in which they are repeatedly and incessantly criticised when they take action to maintain, as they would say, law and order in their own countries, you can take issue with that if you choose, well, perhaps it's not surprising that they bring these sort of topics up. And then he proceeds, I still proceed from the premise that a solution must be found to suit both Belarus and European countries, including Poland, the Federal Republic and other countries, because there is too much strain on their social systems. Conditions must be created for employing those people one way or another and resolve problems between the parties since, as President Lukashenko told me, readmission problems have not been resolved. Efforts were suspended on such issues as migrant accommodation, building camps for them, and so on. I hope that direct contacts between the leaders of Belarus and leading EU countries will help resolve these issues. So what Putin is basically saying is that the right thing to do is not to admit these people into the European Union, not to give them an open door, but to take some steps to house them, to find them some kind of work, presumably in Belarus or Turkey or whatever it is, to set up what he calls migrant accommodation, building camps, those sort of things. And eventually, when he talks about readmission problems, I think what he's referring to there is repatriate them eventually to their countries of origin. And that seems to me to be entirely sensible. But again, he is presupposing that this can be organized and agreed between the European Union and Belarus. And he makes the entirely valid point that this has to be discussed between the European Union and Belarus. And at the moment, the European Union is not prepared to talk to Belarus, which is the source of the whole problem. And then he talks about certain other things. And he now talks about who is responsible, whether this thing has been organized and orchestrated by Lukashenko. And he says the following: I want everyone to know this. That is to say, Russia has absolutely nothing to do with any of this. They're trying to shift the responsibility to us at the slightest pretext or even without any pretext. Our airlines do not carry these people. Not a single one of our airlines is involved. So, all this talk that Putin, and Russia is the great master, we're masterminding this crisis on the Belarus border is an absurd one. And all these threats to sanction our airlines, Aeroflot and the others, is absolutely misguided because we've absolutely nothing to do with this problem. The people who are on the Polish border have not been flying on our aircraft, on our airlines. So it's got nothing to do with us. We shouldn't be sanctioned in any way. And then he discusses the Belarusian side of this and whether the Belarusians have orchestrated this affair. And what he says is, Lukashenko told me that Belavia Airlines does not carry migrants either. They take charter flights, and with a visa-free arrangement, these people just buy their tickets and come over. Indeed, there are certain groups that are shipping these people to the European countries, but these groups have been operating for a long time. And he's talking about the various phony travel agencies that proliferate across the Middle East, which are essentially engaging in trafficking of migrants to Europe. And that's a well-known problem and a long-standing problem, and much of it is carried out entirely illegally, and nothing ever seems to be done effectively about this. But again, what Putin is saying is that these people did not come to Belarus on the Belarusian airline. That's what Lukashenko supposedly told him. They came on charter flights, which presumably means they came on various Middle Eastern airlines. Now, whether or not that is true, I have absolutely no idea. The source for that claim, as Putin makes clear, is Lukashenko himself. Lukashenko may have reasons to be deceptive about this. I'm not going to judge one way or the other. But it certainly repays investigation. Not that I expect we're going to get any of that. And then he goes on to say, the key link is in the EU countries. Those who are located there organise these chains. Let their law enforcement and security services deal with them if they are violating their laws. This is again about the sort of people who traffic or arrange movement of migrants. I should say that I'm very well informed about this. I have personal contacts with people who are involved in handling migrant flows, especially from the Middle East, and about the existence of these networks and these agencies that organise these sort of chains, and the fact that some of them operate from within the European Union and European countries. Putin is absolutely right about that. That is something I can say from direct knowledge. And then he goes on to say the following. I get the impression that it is rather hard to bring them to account there, because if we look at the national legislation of European countries, they are not violating anything. Someone living in one country wants to move to another one due to their concerns, security concerns, or even for economic reasons. If a law is violated, then the law enforcement and security services of these countries must deal with these groups, and they should certainly collaborate with those countries that the migrants cross to get to Europe, including Belarus. Let me stress again, Russia has absolutely nothing to do with this. We are not involved in any processes whatsoever. On the legal difficulties involved in Europe in taking action against some of these networks, I can confirm that also. Again, I have direct knowledge of this, though I do understand that steadily the situation has been changing and that the European authorities, step by step, are gradually getting on top of the legal issues here. But anyway, that's another question. Then we now get on to I'm going to proceed now to the question of Ukraine. I will say that there is another part of this interview in which Putin discusses Lukashenko's wild talk about interrupting gas supplies from Russia to Belarus. Putin makes it entirely and absolutely clear in this interview that as far as Russia is concerned, that is completely unacceptable and that he does not expect it to happen. I agree. I think Lukashenko, as he often does, was talking off the top of his head, and I don't think that statement should be taken at all seriously. There's no conceivable way that Belarus, dependent as it is on Russia at the moment, will take the radical step of interrupting Russian gas supplies to Europe and antagonizing its primary ally, Russia, in that kind of way. And then now we come to the other issues, which are, of course, of major concern. And the first is the build-up of NATO forces and the various movements of NATO troops, and especially aircraft, around Russia's borders. And Putin has a lot to say about this, primarily because it's also been highly publicized in the Russian media. The Russians are obviously noticing the fact that there are all these naval and aircraft exercises taking place. And here is what he has to say. And the interview asks him about the specific question about whether Russia is plotting a military invasion in Ukraine, and that the United States has supposedly warned its European partners that Russia is preparing such an invasion. And this is what Putin has to say. I have not seen such alarmist declarations, so far at least, but I suppose it is as you say. Indeed, the United States and their NATO allies are presently conducting an unscheduled, and I want to stress that this is an unscheduled drill in the Black Sea. They deployed a powerful naval group, and they are also using the Air Force in the drill, including strategic aviation. Here is a part of the answer to your question about where and how our strategic missile carriers fly. They, NATO, use B-52s. These are pretty old aircraft, but it is not the carriers that matter. The point is that they have combat strategic weapons on board, which is a grave challenge for us. I should say that our defense ministry also suggested holding an unscheduled drill in the area of the Black Sea, but I do not think it is expedient, and there is no need to aggravate the situation there even further. But for that reason, the Russian Defense Ministry has limited its actions to escorting their aircraft and ships. This is number one. So he took a decision. He's aware of all these movements of aircraft and ships. He's taken a decision that despite the seriousness of this and the fact that the Russians are keeping a close track on it, and despite the fact that the Defense Ministry wanted to conduct a retaliatory exercise, exercising in the same general area as the Western ships were exercising in the Black Sea, he decided that that would escalate the situation to extremely dangerous levels. He might have seen it, by the way, as an attempt by the US, by the NATO powers, to provoke that kind of escalation. So he decided that for the time being, at least, he wouldn't do it. But he's made it very clear at the same time that Russia is prepared to respond if there is some kind of further action. And then he talks about Ukraine. Second, regarding Ukraine, we are being urged to implement the Minsk agreements and are often accused of not observing them. However, when we ask our partners, including in the Normandy format, now that means France and Germany, exactly which part of the Minsk agreements Russia is not fulfilling and what, in their opinion, Russia is supposed to do under the Minsk agreements, we get no answer. This is exactly what they say. We cannot put it into words. I'm not kidding. This is the dialogue we are having. And what exactly have the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics failed to do regarding the Minsk agreements? There is no answer either. Again, they cannot put it into words. Meanwhile, they publicly demand that we implement them. Now, Putin is absolutely right about this, and I'm going to say that this has been a long-standing problem ever since those agreements were formalized back in February 2015 and was subsequently confirmed by a resolution of the United Nations Security Council. A resolution which, by the way, France and Germany, to my recollection, voted to support, and I believe that the United States and Britain also voted to support it, though perhaps they abstained. I'm not completely sure, one way or another. But regardless, the Minsk agreements make it absolutely clear as crystal that the conflict in Ukraine is an internal one. It is, in other words, a civil war, and it requires the resolution of this conflict, this internal conflict, this civil war, to take place between the relevant parties, which are, of course, Ukraine and the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. France and Germany helped to negotiate the Minsk agreement, so they presumably at the time agreed with that assessment. And as I said, Britain and the United States did not veto the resolution which enshrined the Minsk agreement into international law, and might even have voted for it, thereby in effect also accepting that the conflict in Ukraine is an internal one. The Minsk agreement nowhere says that Russia is obliged to take any step whatsoever until the very last stage of the process, when a new constitution has been agreed as a result of direct negotiations between the parties, and there are new elections in Ukraine leading to the formation of a new national unity government, at which point Russia is supposed to facilitate the control by the newly reorganized Ukrainian state of its border with the Donbass regions. That's the only step that Russia is required to take, and it presupposes first that all the other processes set out in the agreement take place. That obviously has not happened because the Ukrainian government is unwilling to implement any of these things. So when Putin asks them, when the Russians ask the Germans and the French and the Americans, and by the way, from time to time the British, you say that we are not implementing the Minsk agreements. Tell us how we are not implementing the Minsk agreements. The French, the Germans, the Americans and the British all fall silent because, of course, they see the text of the Minsk agreement and they find that this agreement that they either helped to negotiate in the case of France and Germany, or implicitly agreed to in the case of Britain and the United States, makes no demands of Russia whatsoever. I would add that some years ago, I remember reading a report by a British parliamentary committee following a deputation sent by that committee to Moscow, in which they had discussions with the Russians on this very topic. And the MPs who formed that committee and who drafted the report admitted that the Russians made this point to them about the fact that Russia is not actually required to fulfill any commitments under the Minsk agreement. So what exactly is it that they are required or being asked to do to put the Minsk agreement into effect, when in fact the Minsk agreement is silent about any actions that they're required to take? The British MPs conceded that this was the case, and expressed concern about it and some bafflement about what Britain's response should be in relation to all of this. So the Western powers are, of course, fully aware of this, and they find themselves in this impossible position of asking the Russians to implement something which the Russians are not required to implement, whilst ignoring the fact that Ukraine, which is required to implement the Minsk agreement, refuses to do so. And what the Western powers have actually been trying to do is discussed in Putin's next paragraph. And he says this: and now the second issue regarding who is the party to the conflict. The Minsk agreements do not state that Russia is a party to the conflict. We never agreed to this and never will. We are not a party to it. In fact, what we understand is that the Western powers have been trying to square this circle, trying to find a way of getting out of this diplomatic trap with the Minsk agreement that they have walked into by trying to get the Russians to agree that they are in some form or in some way a party to the conflict in Ukraine. And in fact, there have been public declarations about this. There was even a statement to that effect at the recent G7 summit meeting in Cornwall. And the Russians flatly refuse to accept this. They say that is not what the Minsk agreement said. The Minsk agreements state quite clearly that Russia is not, do not state that Russia is a party to this conflict. Russia has never agreed that it is a party to the conflict, and it will never agree that it is a party to the conflict. And if the West persists in trying to get the Russians to agree to this, then the Ukrainian conflict will remain in deadlock. Anyway, he then discusses some of the history, and he has some interesting things to say about the situation, the history of the situation, and he discusses Ukraine's policies. He says, what are the Kiev authorities doing? Note that he calls them the Kiev authorities. As I said, he's never fully accepted the legitimacy of the present political system in Ukraine, which was established following the Maidan events, which Russia qualifies as a coup. But that, as I said earlier in the program, though he doesn't fully recognize the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government and never calls it the Ukrainian government, he always calls it the Kiev authorities. That doesn't mean that he won't in fact talk to them. But anyway, to proceed. What are the Kiev authorities doing? Let me remind you of the most recent history. The acting president, that's, by the way, the president who took over the provisional government that took over in Kiev directly following the Maidan events, made a decision to engage armed forces to resolve the conflict in the southeast, in Donbass. It was the first attempt to resolve the issue by using military force. Then Mr. Poroshenko, this is the first elected president of post-Maidan Ukraine, who by that time had become president, made the second attempt, despite efforts to convince him otherwise, of using the military to resolve the issue. Well, we are well aware of how this attempt ended and what tragedies it brought. It was they who started it. Now the current president merrily reports that they are using the Bayraktars, those are the Turkish-made and supplied drones, that is unmanned combat aerial vehicles. This is aviation. Even though it is unmanned, it is still aviation used in the conflict zone, which is strictly prohibited by the Minsk agreements and subsequent agreements. However, it elicits no response whatsoever. Europe said something inarticulate about it, whilst the US, in effect, supported it. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials say outright, we use them and we will continue to use them further. Concurrently, they arrange unscheduled drills in the Black Sea. there is an impression that they do not want to let us relax. Well, they should know that we do not relax anyway. So there we go. As far as the Russians are concerned, and what Putin is saying is that Russia is always on its guard, has always been throughout its history. When it's let its guard slip, bad things tend to happen. So it's always on its guard. And as far as they're concerned, this pressure that the West is trying to impose upon them in order to get the Russians to make concessions, in other words, for example, to accept that they are a party to the conflict in Ukraine, that is simply not going to happen. The Russians are used to the fact that they are pressured, and they will stand their ground, and they are able to do that indefinitely because that is the nature of their society. That is what their history has taught of them. And then lastly, there is some discussion about the Normandy format and about whether there's any point in proceeding with it. And Putin says, well, at least the Normandy format exists and it's a vehicle for discussions. But very interestingly, he doesn't commit himself to a summit meeting, either with Zelensky or with Zelensky and the French and German leaders as well. So there we are. So I think we can gain some insight now into the general picture of events, at least from a Russian point of view. And I'm going to make a suggestion that we can also get some idea of what Burns was all about when he tried to come to Moscow, amongst other things. So on the Belarus issue, Putin has made it absolutely clear this has nothing to do with Russia. It's a problem between Belarus and the EU. It is a problem the EU has largely made for itself. It stirred up the pot in the Middle East and in Central Asia with all its various regime change wars, which it was involved in alongside the United States. It is simply wrong, according to Putin, that either he or Russia or even Lukashenko orchestrated these events. I'm not entirely sure about that with Lukashenko, where Lukashenko is concerned, but anyway, that's what Putin has to say. And that the way to sort this out is to negotiate directly with Lukashenko and find a way out of this matter that might involve paying the Belarusians money to set up camps and to control refugee flows and migrant flows. And ultimately, the way is to try and agree some program for reconstruction of the countries in the Middle East and in Central Asia so that these people can be repatriated there. It's a pragmatic policy. It's a wise suggestions. It's not the kind of thing that the Western powers have shown any ability at the moment to do. Taking these sort of steps would involve, in the case of talking to Lukashenko, in effect implicitly admitting that the regime change exercise in Belarus, the colour revolution there, has failed, and they don't want to admit that failure. And reconstructing the Middle East in that kind of way would not only be expensive, but it would also, again, be an implicit admission that the regime change wars in the Middle East have been a failure and a disaster. And that's, again, something that the West is unwilling to do, because doing it would, of course, arguably mean that it's something you shouldn't do again in the future. So on Belarus, that's where we stand. On Ukraine, more importantly, we are in total deadlock. The Russians have made it absolutely clear, and Putin implicitly says this again, if there's an attack on the Donbass, Russia will respond. I mean, he's not said it, he's spelled it out in so many words, but he has spoken about it clearly elsewhere. And notice how he is careful to say that when the previous Ukrainian president, Poroshenko, launched a military attack on the Donbass, We are well aware of how this attempt ended and what tragedies it brought. In other words, it ended in an outright Ukrainian defeat, and that is what Ukraine should expect if the same thing is attempted a further time. Anyway, that's one thing. And the second is that the way to resolve the Ukrainian conflict peacefully is through direct talks between Ukraine's government and the leaders of the Donbass republics. And the Russians are not prepared to negotiate a resolution, a settlement of the crisis in Ukraine itself, because they absolutely, adamantly reject any suggestion that they have either created the situation in Ukraine or are responsible for it or are a party to it. They are not a party to the conflict, or so they say. And I'm going to suggest that this is where I think some of the problems with the Burns visit came up. Situation in Ukraine, as I've discussed in several programs now, is getting to be extremely bad. The economic crisis there is deepening, and there are now risks of real energy shortages. Ukraine is struggling to import coal. It can't import coal from Russia. It's finding it difficult to import coal from other places. And at the moment, it's struggling also to find alternatives to gas. It's refusing to buy gas directly from Russia. It finds the cost of buying gas, or paying rather for gas, on the European spot market extortionate, and at the same time, its negotiations to buy gas in the Gulf from states like Qatar, liquefied natural gas, are proving extremely difficult because, I suspect, of the very high cost. So the situation in Ukraine is deteriorating. And Burns and the United States government are concerned, I think, that this deteriorating economic situation is putting the position of Ukraine, its internal stability, at risk. There is a real possibility of a political crisis with some Ukrainian politicians like Yulia Tymoshenko saying that the time has come to talk to the Russians, and other more hardline officials, on the other hand, on the contrary, saying that we must go for broke. This is the moment to press on, try to break the deadlock in the Donbass, perhaps launch an offensive there. And the United States and the Europeans are caught in the middle. On the one hand, they find it politically impossible to repudiate Ukraine. They can't turn their back on this venture that they embarked on back in 2013, 2014, when they set in train the whole sequence of events which led to the Maidan uprising, the violent overthrow of the previous government, and the installation of the new political system, which has been following the policy of Ukrainianization, which has led to this crisis. They can't reject that. They can't turn their back on it. And at the same time, they are extremely worried that if this crisis escalates and there is a war in Donbass, they will find themselves facing the same sort of debacle that they've just experienced in Afghanistan, only an order of magnitude greater. So they are desperate to try and find some means to break out of this trap, and they're piling on pressure on the Russians to try to get the Russians to talk directly to the Ukrainians, to try to get the Russians to take over the negotiations, to in effect concede they are a party to the talks, to the conflict in Ukraine, whilst at the same time piling on the pressure, or rather giving the advice to the Ukrainians, for heaven's sake, don't go to war and invite and bring down disaster upon yourself. And what the Europeans and the Americans are finding is that the Russians are proving absolutely implacable. They are refusing outright, categorically, any suggestion that they should be treated as a party to the conflict. They insist that the only way forward is the way that was agreed in Minsk. And that means direct negotiations between Ukraine and the breakaway republics of the Donbass. And they're not prepared to shift from that position. And the result is that the Americans come away exasperated and frustrated, and the Europeans come away exasperated and frustrated. And as the situation in Ukraine deteriorates, they get increasingly worried about what the effect of all of this might be. Thus, all the talk about a Russian invasion and a possible war. And I think that Burns probably came to Moscow trying again to get the Russians to agree to participate in the negotiations with Ukraine as some sort of a party. And again, the Russians, Patrushev and probably Putin himself, told him, no way. So, where does all this leave us? Well, we see once again that the Russians are taking the toughest possible line, both on Belarus and on Ukraine. Belarus, in my opinion, at the moment is a side issue. Ukraine is not. I've noticed that a British general recently said that he's never been more concerned about the possibilities of war. He thinks the situation today is far more dangerous than it was during the Cold War. I agree. And the reason I think that is so is because Western policy is not realistic. It is trying to put pressure on Russia, which is not willing to submit to that sort of pressure. Putin again said as much, and it is unable to put the necessary pressure on Ukraine to break the impasse. So what will happen? I still think we're unlikely to see a war in Ukraine this winter. I've said many times, I don't believe one starts a war which one is going to lose. So I think that the Europeans, especially Berlin in particular, will be warning the Ukrainians very strongly against going to war with the Russians. And I think ultimately the Ukrainians will have no choice but to submit to these warnings, at least for the time being. But I think also that over time, the situation for the Western powers with Ukraine becomes ever more difficult and ever more complicated. And the risk of something going wrong, of a war, becomes increasingly likely as the situation there goes from bad to worse. Now, in this kind of situation, as I said many times, when you are in a hole, stop digging. The time has come, in fact, it's long overdue, for Western governments to simply acknowledge what is self-evidently true, which is that this whole Ukrainian venture has been a complete disaster. It is a debacle. It was a regime change in European terms too far. It landed the West with this massive commitment to a country, Ukraine, which is unstable, ungovernable, and unable to defend itself. The time has come to liquidate this problem, and the Minsk agreement, which the Western powers themselves agreed to in 2015, provides the route forward. The best thing to do is to return to the Minsk agreement, tell the Ukrainians that they must now abide with it, and bring this whole shabby, disastrous episode to an end. Unfortunately, I see no sign that the political class either in Europe or in the United States, is capable of that. Given that this is so, it seems to me that some sort of breakdown in Ukraine, sooner or later, is inevitable. Given the deterioration we see there, probably sooner rather than later, if not this winter. Well, thank you for joining me again today for this program. Please also remember to join us on our main channel, which is the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. And please also join us on Locals, where I discuss these matters further and in more detail than I do here. Also and especially on live streams, where I'm able to interact with all of you. If you want to put me questions about this topic, critical questions if you wish, well, the right place to do it is on Locals. You'll find links under this video. We are also on other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, and all the rest. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also, of course, by going to our shop and buying the amazing things you will find there. So I look forward to you joining me again soon. Please check your subscription to this channel. Please press the like button to this video if you've liked this video. And thank you for joining me again today. And I look forward to you joining me again soon.